Before anything changes, there is usually a moment when nothing seems different. The environment remains familiar. The rhythm holds. The mind continues to move as it always has. And yet, something subtle begins to shift. Not in what you see, but in how you are positioned within it. This is not a story about discovery. Nothing new will be revealed. What follows is simply a record of what happens when attention stops passing over what was always there and remains. You don't notice the exact moment when it begins. There is no clear transition, no boundary you can point to and say, this was before, this is after. Everything looks the same, and that is what makes it unsettling. You are in a familiar space. It doesn't demand attention. Your body knows how to exist here. Where to look, how to sit, how much awareness is required, and how much can safely be withheld. This place has been rehearsed countless times. Nothing needs to be questioned. And yet, something inside you pauses. Not a thought, not fear. More like a microscopic delay, as if one internal process lags slightly behind the rest. You continue doing what you were doing, but the sense of continuity thins. At first, it stays in the background, barely noticeable. The surroundings don't change. Sounds remain where they should be. Time appears to move forward as usual, but a strange sensation settles in, as though you are no longer fully inside the moment. Not outside it either, just displaced by a fraction. The angle is different. You blink. You check your body. The weight of your posture. The rhythm of breathing, the quiet tension stored in familiar places. Everything responds. Everything is present. And yet the match between sensation and certainty is no longer complete. You find yourself looking longer than necessary, not at anything specific, more like toward something. Your gaze lingers without reason. Objects don't call for attention, but attention refuses to leave. A sense of disproportion emerges. What once felt neutral now carries weight. What used to dissolve into the background becomes dense, as if the space around you has lost its transparency. You are not afraid. Not yet. What you feel is closer to mild confusion, the kind that doesn't turn into a question. You register that something is off, but you don't move to investigate. Time passes, or seems to. It's difficult to be precise now. You notice that your attention behaves differently. It doesn't scatter, but it doesn't settle either. It searches without knowing what it's looking for. An internal tension appears, not emotional, but structural, like two internal systems briefly falling out of sync. You continue functioning, but the automatic flow weakens. Details surface, not because you decided to notice them, but because they insist. The pause between sounds, the intervals between actions, subtle movements that previously never crossed awareness. And then quietly, a realization forms, not as a sentence, but as a state. You are here, but not in the way you were before. You try to restore the old sense of normality without thinking about it. You shift your posture, distract yourself, redirect attention. It works only partially. The background has shifted, and it does not fully return to its former position. A new feeling settles in. Something is happening without your participation, not outside you, within perception itself. As if a process has already started and you are learning about it indirectly, through symptoms. You cannot say what has changed. Any attempt to name it feels premature. The words available to you are either too blunt or too familiar. None of them fit. You stop trying to explain, but the tension continues to build. Not sharply, slowly, like pressure increasing so gradually that it becomes noticeable only through its effects. You realize that returning to the previous state would now require effort, and that realization itself is new. Before, things simply were. Now, they are not. By the end of this moment, You know something without consciously articulating it. This is not an isolated experience. You don't understand where it leads. You don't know what exactly has shifted, but the sense of beginning becomes solid and irreversible. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet acknowledgement takes hold. The process has already started. What happened does not pass. At first, you assume it will. Experiences like this usually dissolve on their own. A night's sleep, a change of focus, a return to routine, that has always been enough. You expect the same now. You move forward as if nothing requires attention. But the underlying sensation remains. It doesn't stay in the foreground. It doesn't demand to be examined. Instead, it appears intermittently, slipping into moments that used to feel automatic. You notice it while doing ordinary things. Things you have done so many times, they barely register. A brief hesitation before responding, a fraction of a second where time feels stretched, an unfamiliar gap between impulse and action. None of it is dramatic. Each instance taken alone could be dismissed, but they repeat, and repetition changes their quality. You begin to sense patterns without actively searching for them. Certain moments feel heavier than others, though nothing distinguishes them externally. The same environment, the same rhythm, yet your internal response arrives altered, as if routed through a slightly different channel. Time behaves inconsistently. Sometimes it compresses, hours slipping by unnoticed. Other times it expands, a few seconds carrying an unexpected density. You check clocks more often, not because you are late, but because something feels misaligned. Your attention no longer follows its old habits. It lingers where it once skimmed. It withdraws where it used to engage. This isn't a deliberate choice. It happens before you can intervene. You begin noticing that certain thoughts don't complete themselves. They start along familiar paths and then lose momentum, dissolving before reaching their usual conclusions. The mind pauses, as if encountering an invisible barrier. Emotional reactions shift as well. Situations that once triggered clear responses now produce something muted or delayed. Not absence, just alteration. The emotion arrives late, or arrives distorted, or doesn't arrive at all. In its place is a quiet alertness you didn't invite. You still recognize yourself. Nothing feels foreign enough to cause alarm. But the continuity of identity, the sense of being the same from moment to moment, becomes less seamless. There are tiny seams now, barely visible, but present. You catch yourself re-examining moments after they pass. Not obsessively, just briefly, as if checking whether something important was missed. Often, there is nothing to find. The impulse itself is what stands out. The world continues unchanged. Conversations proceed normally. Responsibilities remain intact. From the outside, nothing has shifted. And yet, you carry a growing awareness that what you experience internally no longer aligns perfectly with what is expected. You start to recognize the sensation before it fully arrives. A subtle tightening, a quiet, internal adjustment. It happens often enough that it becomes familiar, though not comfortable. There is no clear trigger. It doesn't depend on mood or circumstance. It appears in moments of rest and moments of activity alike. This consistency unsettles you more than intensity would. You attempt to interpret what is happening, but familiar frameworks fail quickly. The explanations you once relied on feel insufficient, too shallow to hold the experience. You abandon them without replacing them. Instead, you observe. And observation itself feels different now, less intrusive, more passive, as if something in you has stepped back, allowing perception to unfold without immediate categorization. With this comes a growing doubt, not about reality, but about your previous way of navigating it. You begin to sense that the tools you use to rely on are no longer precise. They still function, but they slip. By the end of this phase, a quiet tension has formed. It is no longer possible to treat the initial shift as an anomaly. Too many moments echo it. Too many small confirmations accumulate. You don't know what this means. You don't know what direction it points toward. But one thing becomes increasingly clear. Returning to how things were feels less accessible with each passing moment. And the recognition, once faint, now settles in with steady weight. This is continuing. At some point, you begin trying to stop it. Not directly. You don't think of it as resistance at first. It feels more like correction, an attempt to restore balance, to reestablish a familiar rhythm. You tell yourself that nothing is actually wrong, that what you noticed was a fluctuation, a temporary misalignment. You lean harder into routine. You fill your days with structure, tasks, lists, obligations. You focus on efficiency, on getting things done the way you always have. The familiar sequence of actions provides brief relief. While you are occupied, the tension recedes slightly, retreating to the edges. You increase the pace. Less silence, less idle attention, less room for anything undefined. It works, partially. The sensation doesn't disappear. It compresses. It becomes more localized, more pointed. Instead of a diffuse background shift, it turns into pressure that appears at specific moments. When you pause, when you finish something, when there is nothing immediately demanding your response. You catch yourself dismissing those moments quickly. You reach for distractions without thinking, screens, noise, information, anything that keeps perception moving forward without settling. There is a voice, not literal, not external, that insists on familiarity. It urges you to interpret what you feel using old categories: fatigue, stress, overthinking, normal explanations. You've used them before. They still sound reasonable. You repeat them often enough that they almost regain their authority. Almost. Because beneath them, something resists being reduced. You notice how quickly discomfort now arises when things slow down. Waiting becomes harder. Silence feels charged. Unstructured time carries an unfamiliar density. You begin avoiding these states, even though you can't explain why. You attempt to regain control through analysis. You replay recent experiences, searching for causal chains, for something concrete you can isolate. The effort feels productive, but the results are thin. Each explanation dissolves as soon as you try to hold it. The mechanism pushes back. It urges you to define yourself clearly again, through roles, habits, expectations. It reminds you of who you are supposed to be, how you usually react, what makes sense for you to notice and what does not. You comply instinctively. You adjust your behavior to match the outline you recognize. For brief stretches, this creates stability. The world feels flatter, easier to navigate. But the cost increases. Ignoring the underlying shift now requires sustained effort. You feel it in the body, a subtle fatigue that doesn't correspond to activity, a tension that doesn't release with rest, as if energy is being spent continuously to maintain a position that no longer holds naturally. Moments of recognition still break through, quieter now, but sharper. They appear when you least expect them, mid-conversation, mid-movement, mid-thought. A sudden awareness that what you're doing feels slightly misaligned, like wearing a well-fitting suit that no longer belongs to you. You push those moments away faster than before. You can feel the reflex strengthening. The system learns, it adapts. It becomes more efficient at preserving the familiar, and yet the pressure doesn't decrease. It reorganizes. The sensation you once noticed as vague unease now takes on direction. It presses against specific habits, specific assumptions. It highlights the effort required to keep everything unchanged. You begin to sense the asymmetry. Maintaining the old state is no longer passive. It is work. By the end of this phase, a quiet realization takes shape, not as acceptance, but as friction. The energy spent on avoidance is becoming noticeable. The resistance itself is now part of your experience, tangible and persistent. You don't stop resisting, but you feel the strain of doing so. And somewhere beneath the effort, a question forms, not about what is happening, but about how long this can continue. There is no moment of clarity in the way you once imagined it. No sudden alignment, no internal click that resolves the tension. What arrives instead is quieter and heavier, a recognition that does not announce itself, but settles slowly, leaving no space untouched. You stop trying to force the previous structure back into place, not because you decide to, but because the effort finally reveals itself fully. The resistance has weight now. You feel how much energy it consumes, how much attention it demands just to maintain what once required none. And in that awareness, something shifts again. You begin to sense the change not as an event, but as a difference in orientation. The way perception organizes itself has altered. The world is still the same, but the axis around which it turns is no longer where it used to be. You notice how often you relied on automatic interpretation, how quickly experiences were labeled, filed, neutralized, how efficiently meaning was applied before anything could remain unresolved. That mechanism no longer activates with the same certainty. There is more space now, not comforting, not expansive, but exposed. Moments are less buffered. Sensations arrive without immediate framing. Thoughts surface without being instantly resolved into conclusions. This is not freedom. It is not relief. It is a stripping away of something that once made things easier. You realize that what changed is not the external flow of life, but your position within it. The distance between perception and explanation has widened. Where there was once immediacy, there is now suspension. You see how often you used familiarity as a substitute for understanding, how recognition replaced presence, how repetition created the illusion of stability. None of this feels accusatory. It simply becomes visible. The truth does not present itself as a statement. It emerges as an absence of the old filters, an absence of the reflex to collapse experience into certainty. What remains is raw, less manageable. You cannot lean on previous assumptions to navigate it. They still exist, but they no longer anchor you in the same way. You become aware that the earlier sense of coherence depended on not noticing certain things, not because they were hidden, but because attention habitually passed over them. Now, attention pauses where it once slid through. There is no instruction embedded in this realization. No implication that something must be done next. The mind searches for direction and finds none. This is what unsettles you most. You understand, without relief, that the old model of reality functioned by smoothing over gaps, by resolving ambiguity before it could be felt. That smoothing has stopped. The gaps remain open. You feel the full weight of irreversibility, not as drama, but as fact. You know you cannot unsee this change, cannot return to the previous mode without continuous effort that now feels artificial. The tension does not resolve, it stabilizes. Silence takes on a new quality, not emptiness, but density. It no longer feels like a pause between moments, but like a field in which moments occur. You remain functional, capable, present. But the sense of being carried effortlessly by familiar structures is gone. There is no comfort offered here, no reassurance that this leads somewhere better, no promise of integration, only the quiet certainty that something fundamental has shifted, and that this shift does not require your agreement to persist. The truth was never concealed. It was never distant. It was never waiting to be discovered. It was positioned exactly where you were least likely to look, within the mechanisms that once made everything feel normal. And now, standing in the stillness that follows this recognition, you feel the weight of continuity extend forward, beyond this moment, beyond this awareness, not as a path, not as a resolution, but as something that continues, whether you are ready for it or not. Nothing announces the return. There is no signal that you have arrived somewhere familiar, no marker to indicate that what you are experiencing has already occurred. The environment presents itself plainly, without emphasis, without weight, exactly as it always has. You find yourself in a situation you recognize, the posture of your body, the arrangement of space, the quiet assumptions about what comes next. All of it aligns with memory. This should feel stable, predictable, ordinary, and yet it doesn't. The difference is subtle enough that you almost miss it, almost dismiss it as residue, an after effect that will fade with time. But something in you has learned to notice pauses, and there is a pause here. You occupy the same role. From the outside, nothing distinguishes this iteration from the countless ones that came before it. From the inside, the continuity is thinner. You sense the edges now, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to register that the flow is not seamless. The experience unfolds, but you are aware of it unfolding. The familiar does not fully absorb you. Attention behaves differently. It does not collapse into habit as easily. It remains slightly open, slightly detached, as if waiting for something it does not expect to arrive. You notice how quickly recognition used to replace presence, how swiftly you recognize the structure of the moment, and simultaneously you recognize your distance from it. Not separation, not alienation, just a clear awareness that participation no longer erases observation. You understand now why this place once felt effortless. How much was carried by automation? How much was smoothed over by familiarity? That mechanism still exists. It activates out of habit. It tries to pull you fully back in. It does not quite succeed. You feel the cycle attempting to close, to reset perception to its previous state. The gestures repeat. The patterns reassert themselves. Everything encourages you to forget what has not as interruption, but as reminder. The same reminder, delivered without urgency, without insistence, simply present. You realize that the beginning was never singular. It was recursive. Each entry into the familiar carried the possibility of noticing, or not noticing. Before, the noticing never occurred. Now, it does. There is no sense of progress here, no movement toward resolution. The cycle does not ascend, it does not conclude. It merely continues, looping through the same terrain with altered perception. You do not feel elevated. You do not feel enlightened. You feel exposed to repetition without insulation. Moments repeat, but they no longer fully overwrite themselves. Traces remain, a faint accumulation of awareness that does not consolidate into meaning. You see the start again, not as origin, but as position, a place you pass through, not realizing how often you have already been here. The truth is not revealed anew. It does not need to be. It is present in the structure of the repetition itself, in the fact that nothing external needs to change for perception to register difference. You remain inside the cycle, functioning, participating, moving forward in time. But now, each return carries a quiet tension, the knowledge that the beginning is not behind you and the ending is not ahead. They are embedded in the same moment. And as the cycle continues, unmarked and uninterrupted, you feel the weight of this awareness settle into permanence, not as a conclusion, but as a condition. The truth remains where it always was, right in front of you.